Singularity. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoyed this podcast, you can help me in one of two ways. Number one is you can go on iTunes and write a brief review about my podcast. It would really help me a lot. And number two is you can simply go to interviewthefuture.com and make a donation. Now, I want to start our episode today with a brief story. There are very few moments that stand out in my time from my time when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, and one such moment was the following. So I was in front of a room full of students trying to make two identical pendulums behave in a perfect synchrony and go perfectly together. Now, I gave it a number of attempts, and perhaps the best that I could do at the time was, I think, 30, if I'm generous to myself, maybe 45 seconds or so, which actually kind of impressed my professor at the time. Maybe it was the best attempt at that time. But yet, the whole point of that course, or at least that lesson, was about the topic of complexity. And of course, the specific moral of the story was how nearly identical complex system that start at seemingly identical conditions can very quickly diverge and start behaving in a very radically different, divergent way. And not only that, but how it is incredibly hard to understand those complex systems to begin with, how it's even harder to predict how they will behave in the future, and maybe even harder than that to try and attempt to control such systems. So needless to say, that was one of my favorite memories from undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. And the professor who was teaching that course was actually a very famous superstar professor. He's the author of a number of fantastic books. The first one that I read back in the day was called The Ingenuity Gap. Then his next book was The Upside of Down. And most recently, and the topic of our conversation today, his recent book is called Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. So, without further ado, Thomas Homer-Dixon, welcome to Singularity FM.
No, I'm delighted to be with you, and that's such a fun story. I remember the moment well.
You do? Really?
Oh, absolutely. So this is a double-hinged pendulum, and it was two double-hinged pendulums together. So for folks who are not in the know, these are really quite extraordinary devices. So it's a pendulum with two pivots, basically, one at the top like a normal pendulum, and then another one in the middle of the arm of the pendulum. And they're designed so that both of those pivots can operate simultaneously. And if you have two of these side by side, as was the case here, you can do your very best to try to make them behave in exactly the same way when they're dropped from a height. And they very quickly, as you were saying, diverge in their behavior, because even the tiniest factors, a slight tremor of the hand or maybe a bit of air turbulence in the room that influences one and not the other, will produce ultimately a huge difference in how they behave and the way they flip back and forth. So it's a really fun demonstration. It impresses everybody. But I didn't get everybody to come up to the front of the class. I think you were one of the only ones to actually try it out.
Yeah, I was always the kid who would sit on the first row in all my classes, actually. So precisely for moments like that. But interestingly enough, out of my 5 years at U of T, that moment has like really left a mark in my mind. And it's like kind of like a real amazing lesson that I've taken with me ever since. To be honest, I don't remember that much else from that class. But the complexity moral of that story is like, now I can't even forget it. It's so well taught.
So the interesting thing is that was I had that pendulum, and I was using it in another course, and I think I just brought it into the class that you were in, just to give people a quick demonstration of this general idea. The complexity scientists call it sensitivity to initial conditions, and these double-hinged pendulums are highly sensitive to initial conditions. And just to tie this story off, one of the people in that class that I was actually taking the pendulum to was an undergraduate student, Mike Lawrence, who went on to Waterloo to study with me as a master's student and ultimately as a PhD. And when he finished his PhD, he was so thrilled that he had his father, who is an accomplished machinist, actually build a double-hinged pendulum and as a thank you present and send it out to me here in British Columbia. I haven't put it together yet, but I'm very excited because they're just such wonderful demonstrations of this basic principle.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Thomas, unfortunately, not all of our audience, or probably none of them, had this amazing opportunity to study with you or under you. So if we presume that they have complete ignorance about who you are and what you have done, and let's say you meet them one-on-one at a conference or in a bar somewhere in Victoria or elsewhere in the world, in the good old days when we actually could meet physically together, how would you introduce yourself? Who is Thomas Homer-Dixon?
I'm a writer and I'm an academic and an enormously curious person who is very concerned about the world that my children are going to inherit. Sarah and I have two children, a 15-year-old boy, Ben, and a 12-year-old girl, Kate. And so a very important part of my identity is as a father to these two children. Feel like any parent, enormous responsibility to them. My academic work has focused on, over the years, on the sources of violent conflict. So when I started as an undergraduate and went on to do my doctorate at MIT, I was very interested and still remain very interested in why people fight each other, why people kill each other en masse, sometimes millions of deaths that result from mass conflicts between human beings. I still regard that as an extraordinarily bizarre behavior, and I wanted to understand that more deeply. And then the other part of my academic interest focuses on our relationships with the natural world. I'm fundamentally an environmentalist. I'm deeply concerned about climate change. I'm very anxious to see the energy transition towards a zero carbon economy underway faster than it's happening. So I've brought those interests together in my work, the relationship between social breakdown and environmental stress, how various kinds of environmental problems such as climate change might ultimately undermine social stability around the world, and how we can prevent that from happening. So my writing focuses most specifically on those issues.
Yeah, I remember when we were in that class, we were studying excerpts from your first book that was on environment, scarcity, and violence. But perhaps another short sideways story. Why do you go by Tad instead of Thomas? Is there a story behind that?
Not much, no. Although it does relate to the current book, Commanding Hope. When I was born, I'm not a spring chicken. I was born in 1956, and the Doonesbury strip of those days. Of course, Doonesbury is a bit dated now. A lot of people wouldn't remember it, but it's a highly political cartoon strip of those days. Was Pogo by Walt Kelly, and Pogo. It was a family or a community of animals in the Everglades swamps of Florida, and my parents were huge fans of the Walt Kelly strip Pogo. And Pogo, who's an opossum, would refer to the Tads, which were the little animals running around in the swamp. And when I was born, I was this small thing in a crib, and so they started referring to me as the Tad in the crib. And it stuck. So the connection to the book Commanding Hope is I actually include a very famous cartoon from Walt Kelly, Pogo cartoon, in the book, and people have probably heard this expression. Pogo is sitting on the edge of a swamp that's full of junk, garbage, tin cans, plastic, old tires and things. And he says to the friend beside him, he says, "We have seen the enemy and he is us." And it's probably Walt Kelly's most famous aphorism. We have seen the enemy and he is us. And I refer to it and I include the cartoon because when it comes to problems like climate change, we are we can't externalize these problems and say they're somebody else's fault. We're all in some sense responsible. Our fundamental human natures as consumers, as top predators, and various other characteristics of human beings and the social structures they set up have created this problem of climate change. So it's very internal to us. It's not something we can blame on other people. And I use Walt Kelly's cartoon as a way of just hammering home that point.
I think it's a great story, and I think it's a great cartoon, and it's full of wisdom and insight, and it goes to the heart of the problem, to represent and capture what the problem is, but also to represent and capture why is it so hard to actually go about resolving it. So we are going to jump right into your book and start talking about the meat of the matter here. However, before that, I just want to ask you with one sentence each, perhaps, just so that we get the chronology of Tad's sort of intellectual ideas in terms of books. What's the thesis of your the ingenuity gap, and what's the thesis of the upside of down, so that then we can see how the next thesis of your latest book compares within that kind of line of thinking?
Sure, that's great. So you're quite right that these are it's sort of a trilogy of books. Now, you mentioned one other thing, just as sort of a precursor, which was the original academic book I did from Princeton University Press, which was titled "Environment, Scarcity, and Violence." It's still in print 20 years after it was published, and that really focuses on those relationships between environmental stress and violent conflict. That was the beginning of my academic trajectory, I guess you could say, after I came out of graduate school. But I realized that one of the critical problems, one of the issues that had to be addressed if we were trying to understand why some societies suffer so much from environments, water scarcity, deforestation, absence of cultural land, and have critical to economic results, poverty, mass migrations of people because of those environmental problems, is because they couldn't solve those problems effectively. They couldn't generate solutions. Either they didn't have the right institutional arrangements, or they didn't have the right scientific establishments to generate solutions to those problems. So that led me to this idea of the ingenuity gap, which is basically the idea that humankind is facing an increasing gap between our need for solutions, or what I call ingenuity, and our ability to deliver those solutions. And so the book is really about whether we can solve the problems of the future, whether our problems are becoming too complex and too difficult for us given our capacity to deliver solutions through our political systems, our social systems, our research institutions, et cetera. And it's not entirely a bleak story, but I do suggest that our problems are becoming harder faster than we can solve them. And Exhibit A would be climate change. It's a problem that for some reason we can't really address effectively, and it's the reasons why are not obvious and not straightforward. And so I spend a fair amount of time in the book unpacking those reasons. So basically, two parts to the problem. One is what are the factors making our problems more difficult, whether it's climate change or widening economic and social inequalities, deepening political polarization in our societies. And then on the other hand, what are the factors that are keeping us from responding effectively? Most analysts don't separate those two questions very clearly. So that was the first book, The Ingenuity Gap, which came out in 2000. And the second book, The Upside of Down, took the analysis of the humankind's crisis a number of steps further and looked at basically the question, if we have a chronic ingenuity gap, if we can't solve our problems, what are the ultimate consequences? And I talked about the possibilities of major social ruptures and societal collapses as a result of an inability to address these huge challenges that we face. And I used the example of Rome, the Roman Empire, and why it collapsed. And I examined ways in which our current situation is similar, but also different from the Roman crisis. The title, The Upside of Down, though, is supposed to suggest that these crises that are emerging in the future could provide opportunities for creative renewal of our societies and institutions. The upside of crisis, the upside of down. So that was the second book, and it came out in 2006. And a lot of critics said at the point, and they were quite right, that there was a lot of down in that book and not a lot of upside. and it's partly because I kind of ran out of space. I'd written about 130,000 words, and I more or less finished my analysis of why we're facing major social ruptures and perhaps even societal collapse. And I hadn't gotten to the upside. But the other part of it was that I actually wasn't ready to write that upside. It took me ultimately another 14 years to publish the third book, which I worked on for a total of 8 years. It was by far the hardest of all the books I've ever written to write. I started it 3 times. Twice I threw out enormous amounts of material because it wasn't working. It was only in 2016 that I realized it really had to be about hope, that the core of my prescription, the 2 first books, The Ingenuity Gap and The Upside Down, were both highly diagnostic. But the core of my prescription in this third book had to be a focus of hope, on the concept of hope and why it's so important and how we can sustain it. And I realized that had to be the case again through my children, because I realized that the thing that was giving me the most anguish in the world, most a sense of crisis, was the possibility that my children would grow up, merge into the world as adults and lose their sense of hope, into a world of turbulent violence, and would lose sense of hope. So that's when things really started to crystallize at that point. And it really is the third book in a trilogy. I don't know if I have any more books to write at this point. I think I kind of said what I wanted to say, but it took longer than I expected.
Wow. So, okay. So I remember even, that surprised me in a number, like seeing your next book's title containing the word hope really surprised me in so many different ways. So first of all, I remember from undergrad, you had a bit of a reputation as Dr. Doom, if I remember correctly. Secondly, I remember a conversation I had with you once when I came to visit you in your office hours, and how we were talking about our shared interest in philosophy, and how you're sharing with me that you felt like you didn't make much progress there, and how you went into a lot more rigorous scientific approach where you can actually measure things and where you can actually see that you've made the difference and you've made some progress. And now you're throwing in a concept, so I'm going to ask you to break down this concept for us. What is hope, and can we measure it? How do we define it even? Because that's what really surprised me here. It's not really a scientific concept that many scientists would like point or steer us towards.
Yes. So, you're quite right that just to go back, first of all, I think that the first 2 books I wrote laid out a diagnosis that was quite, by many standards of the time, pessimistic. So I was labeled the Doommeister or Dr. Doom, because I was saying that, as we get into the 2020s, things are going to start to become very, very difficult. And we're going to see major social disruptions as a result of this panoply of challenges that humankind is facing.
Yeah, I should interrupt just for a second and saying that in one of your first books, you even predicted the financial crisis of 2008. In a way.
Yes. So actually, the Upside Down, it's not a long passage, but I actually pointed to the instabilities in the housing market in the United States, and I said that this could be a source of a global financial crisis. I mean, there were other people saying that kind of thing, but by the standards of the time, I was a pessimist, even though I sort of characterized myself as a realist. I looked at the data and the science that I had, and just said that we're in real trouble. So I think nowadays that trouble is more broadly. So honestly, I get this thing about being Dr. Doom and sort of dismissed as a pessimist. I get that much less. Now people are coming to me and saying, so what's going to happen next? And actually, compared to where I was in the early 2000s, I have a much less clear understanding of where we're going in the future. Because what's happening now is the system is unstable. Global systems and social systems are unstable, and so they become unlocked, and there's more possibility for variance in the future, both positive and negative.
More and more hinges in the pendulum.
More hinges in the pendulum, exactly. So that gets to the second issue that you raised, which is my somewhat complex relationship with philosophy. I love philosophy, and it's informed me enormously all the way back to my graduate work, analytical philosophy in particular, philosophy of mind. But ultimately, one has to actually try to do things. If I'm concerned about the future of my kids, what is it that we're going to do in the world? We're not just going to think about it and try to parse it and break it apart into pieces and understand what's going on. We actually need to intervene and try to change things. And so this third book is very much a book about activism. It's about personal engagement. It's about agency, how we can make the world better as individuals and perhaps collectively as societies. And so I decided, as I said, in 2016 or so, that it really needed to be about hope because I was concerned about my kids losing hope. But then the analytical philosophical side of me emerged, and I said, okay, so what is this thing, hope? Because a lot of people dismiss it and say that it's a kind of weak emotion, it's distracting, it leads us to wishful thinking. And so, what is the thinking about hope? And if we apply our scientific lens to it, what can we do perhaps to make it a more powerful and significant and useful emotion in our lives? Which is why the title of the book is Commanding Hope. There's this idea that we can, in a sense, make hope do our bidding. We can command it to be a useful, powerful emotion for us. And then the version of hope that we come up with, which I articulate in the book, is itself, it commands our attention. It's powerful. It's a powerful notion of hope. It's a muscular notion of hope. So I build that out in 3 stages. I talk about honest hope, astute hope, and powerful hope. All 3 of those components, honest, astute, and powerful, are components of this larger notion of commanding hope. And honest hope is basically about making sure that our hope is grounded in a realistic understanding we face ourselves about how difficult, say, climate change is, or the economic crises that some world are facing, that we actually acknowledge with the best scientific information we have how serious those are. So that's, in a sense, honest hope is a relationship to truth. It's a moral stance towards truth. Astute hope is about the kind of knowledge that we should have if we're going to hope well. And I put a lot of emphasis on accurate knowledge, how we think about the world and how other people think about the world.
So, Thomas, we had a brief technical interruption or intermission, unfortunately, but we're back online. So perhaps you already shared with us about honest hope. Perhaps you can walk us through the next 2 steps or 2 different types of hopes that you talk about in your book.
Sure. Thank you for everybody's patience on this. So the second of the components of commanding hope is what I call astute hope. And this is really more of an epistemological stance. If the first is a moral attitude or a moral stance towards truth, this is a kind of hope that reflects a particular form of knowledge. In this case, knowledge about how we look at the world and what our perspectives are, especially our sort of ideological, social, and economic perspectives, as well as how other people look at the world, and especially try to unpack how our potential allies in political mobilization and potential opponents, if we're trying to achieve solutions to something like climate change, how those opponents look at the world and understand better their perspectives. So that's the grounding of astute hope. And I introduce in the book several tools that allow people to unpack worldviews more effectively, ideological perspectives on issues such as climate change or inequality and the way societies should operate now and in the future. And then the third component is what I call powerful hope. And this is a hope that's focused on a very clear object or vision of the future. So some notions of hope aren't really oriented towards a view of the future. They are what psychologists would call objectless. But my notion of hope is one that articulates an idea of the future, a possible world that is very attractive and that can motivate us to push through the challenges that we face today and the challenges we'll face in the future. And that's more of a psychological stance. If the first is a moral stance towards truth, the second is an epistemological stance towards the kind of knowledge that we need to hope well. The third is a psychological perspective on what hope needs to be in order to give us a sense of agency and powerful motivation to persevere through difficult times. So those three components, I mean, frankly, they're a reflection of my own kind of hope. My hope is realistic, ruthlessly realistic about the nature of the challenges we face. I spend a lot of time thinking about how the people around me are looking at the world so that I can either ally with them more effectively, talk to them more effectively, bridge my differences with them, or strategically work around them in my political engagement to try to solve problems like climate change. And then thirdly, it all only matters if I have an idea of where I want to go. What is the world that I want to have in the future that is appealing and that a world in which I think my children will thrive? So in some sense, this notion of hope is very much a reflection of the way I unpack the concept. But in the book, I ground this in philosophy and psychology, positive psychology in particular, because there are a lot of people out there who've thought very clearly and well about hope. And so that's those ideas are a starting point for the way I approach the topic.
And one key takeaway for me from the beginning of the book on hope from you that I think I'm going to take on from now on in my sort of everyday life, and it would make me self-conscious about the way I speak about hope and the way I use hope even, is the distinction between hope that and hope to. Can you please talk us through that, please?
Yeah, so this is an important part of what I guess I would call powerful hope. It's the distinction that allows us to have a sense of agency in our use of hope. So most people, when they're asked about hope, will use statements like, I hope that it's sunny tomorrow, or maybe, more in a moment of humor, I hope that I win the lottery. Or in very practical sense, I hope that my ill mother will get better if she's got cancer or something like that. So these are common hope statements, but each one is a hope that locution or a hope that expression. So I hope that something will come to pass. A possible world in the future that I desire will come to pass. It's very passive. There's this sense that we have no control over any of those outcomes, and in many cases we may not. So, for instance, I don't have any control over the weather. It's sunny today, as you can see, but tomorrow it might not be. I can hope that it's going to be sunny, but I can't actually change it one way or the other. And that may be true with, for instance, my mother's illness. But I argue with commanding hope that, at least with respect to the challenges that humankind faces, these terrible problems that we're facing, we need to adopt a different kind of locution, a hope to locution. Now, every time you say, I hope to something, there's a verb. There's a verb that follows hope to. It's a verb that says we are going to be actively engaged. I hope to plant my garden tomorrow. I hope to convince my neighbors to not play their music so loudly. I hope to, I hope to work with my community to try to limit carbon emissions. I hope to help the world cap global warming at 1.5 degrees. In each case, we're saying I'm going to be a part of that process. I have agency. Some small role to play in producing that desirable world that we are hoping for. And so it's a very different approach to hope. And that's at the core of my notion of powerful hope, because that's a notion of hope that really emphasizes agency, our capacity to actually make a difference in the world. And I think one of the reasons that hope is frequently criticized and regarded as a passive emotion is because people automatically think of it in terms of hope that. Mm-hmm. But it's quite easy to make the flip to hope to, and that's something I encourage in the book.
That's why I believe it as a matter of personal exercise and personal conduct. I think it's a very healthy to switch myself from the sort of classic hope that to hope to, which immediately puts the responsibility or the onus on me to realize or recognize and acknowledge the fact that I am to some degree or another participant in the action, and therefore to some degree or another I do have an import and impact on the whole system, and I'm responsible for recognizing at least that fact, and I'm responsible for at least controlling my own maybe minuscule part of the system, but still I'm responsible for that, and I should be proactive about it rather than passive. So I thank you for that kind of insight. I think it's very healthy.
There's one other thing too, and this sort of reflects this idea that Reinhold Niebuhr suggested in the middle of the 20th century, to have the wisdom to distinguish between those situations we can change and those situations we can't. So it is important to sometimes say, the best I can do is to hope that in this situation. And part of what honest hope is about is teasing out the places where we can have agency and make a difference and the places where we can't. Although I argue that frequently we throw up our hands too soon and say there's nothing we can do, whereas in many cases, if we use our imaginations a bit, there's a lot we can do. So we have to be very careful about shifting back to hope that. We should start with hope too. What can I do? And then if in the end we decide there's not much we can do or nothing, then we move on to what we can do. But that's a very important process of using our imaginations to explore possibilities before we make that we decide that the situation is more deterministic and there's not so much we can do.
Let me just ask you to zoom back out a little bit with me and talk about the subtitle, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. Now, we discussed sort of the power and our responsibility with that distinction about hope, but let's talk about a world in peril. Now, if I were to ask you to zoom out as far away as possible and think about what is the biggest top 2 or 3 perils that humanity as a civilization is facing today, how would you rank them?
Well, right at the top of the list, and not the top of most people's lists, but right at the top of my list, is our absolutely disastrous relationship with the natural systems around us. And the fact that we are pushing those natural systems beyond the boundary of their capacity to repair themselves or to stabilize themselves. I mean, climate change is the most obvious example, I think, now to people. Most people get that we've got a real problem with climate. I don't think they realize how serious the problem is for the most part. But our disastrous relationship with the natural world is manifesting itself in a lot of ways. Collapsing pollinator systems, and we need pollinators to produce a lot of our food. Disappearing fish stocks around the world, coral reefs dying. Coral reef supply are the fisheries that are supported by coral reefs are the principal source of protein for about 1 billion people on the planet. Mammalian populations around the planet are collapsing. And so we're starting to get a lot of signals that the resource extraction and the pollution output into our resource extraction from and pollution output into our natural systems are starting to push these systems beyond the boundaries of their stabilizing mechanisms. And if they flip, once you get, and I start the book with a story about this, once they flip into a different state, we're not going to be able to get them back into the productive, stable states that have allowed human civilization to flourish. So for me, that envelope of natural systems around human civilization is vitally important and gets nowhere near as much attention as it deserves. And to the extent that we're just damaging it or destroying it, it's going to rebound on our civilizations and undermine our economic well-being, dramatically reduce ultimately our gross domestic product, the amount of goods and services we can produce through our economies. And that will in turn affect social and political stability to the extent that our economies become weaker, less productive. We're going to deepen divisions within our societies. Rich and powerful groups will do what they can to hold on to what they've got, and others will become increasingly vulnerable to stress and, of course, to the environmental shocks that are at the same time increasing in becoming increasingly extreme. So so this is a bad future. We wreck our natural environment, we end up wrecking our economies, and we wreck our political and social stability. So this goes back, to the beginning of our interview where I talked about my very early research, and it's ultimately why I spend so much time in my books talking about issues such as climate change. Climate change is going to become this century the dominant threat to the human species. I have absolutely no doubt about that. If we go even to 3 degrees warming, and we're about 1.2 right at the moment, above pre-industrial temperatures, but if we go to even 3 degrees warming, there isn't an ecosystem on the planet that will not be shredded by that. And there's no prospect for anything resembling liberal democracy to survive in a world that's 3 degrees warmer than it was pre-industrial times. We won't be able to grow the food, among other things, that we need to support the 10 billion people who will be on the planet. So that's right at the top of my list. And then there are a series of, I guess you could say, sort of subordinate or derivative problems. I've sort of talked about them. Widening economic inequalities, rising political polarization, the rise of populist authoritarianism, some of the technological stresses that our societies are facing, which are creating, I'm thinking, for instance, in particular of recent developments in social media technologies that seem to be reinforcing divides between groups and deepening we-they divisions between identity groups. And here's a big one, and I think, and this is sort of at the confluence point of a lot of this stuff, is what I would call a kind of epistemic fragmentation, where we're losing the ability as societies to have agreement on very basic facts. And to the extent that we don't agree on basic facts about the nature of the world and the nature of the challenges we face, it's very hard to solve those problems effectively. Democracy, for instance, can't effectively function if the people who are talking to each other don't actually agree on what the problems are and don't have a basic agreement about the facts of the matter or the nature of reality around them. And that epistemic fragmentation is now rife, especially within Western democracies, and we can see it, of course, in the United States. So that's I guess you could say, my short list of challenges. And it's daunting because they're all happening simultaneously in a way people don't recognize. They're all kind of integrated with each other, and they're reinforcing each other. People call this kind of perfect storm, but they don't. But the problem with the language, the perfect storm terminology, is it sort of implies that each one of these things, whether it's economic stress or climate change or political polarization, rising authoritarianism, collapse of mammalian populations, that they're all kind of separate, distinct problems. But actually, they're all affecting each other at this point. And it's those synergies, that's kind of synchronization of these problems that's most dangerous for us, because it kind of it's likely, and this is a point I make going all the way back to the ingenuity gap, it's likely to kind of overwhelm our coping mechanisms, our institutions, our capacity to solve problems. So this is it's a thick stew of issues for us. And I can understand why, and this is where hope comes in. A lot of people look at it and say, and to the extent they understand what's going on, they say, oh, wow, can't deal with this. This is too big. This is too much. I'm just a little person. There's nothing I can do. And they either deny that it's happening or just end up in despair and walk away and throw up their hands.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get into that in a second, but before that, let me just push back a little bit, not from my thoughts, because I actually really like that epistemic fragmentation thesis. I haven't heard it defined quite like that before, and I absolutely love it. I think it's perfectly capturing sort of the foundation of the problem, because we're kind of like playing a game, but if we are playing under the same rules, then we're playing the same game, then we can get somewhere. But if we're not playing under the same rules, or we're refusing to even recognize that even we're playing with each other or something, then it becomes really dangerous because It's completely out of control. And then it becomes really unpredictable, right? And I think that concept of epistemic fragmentation really captures it well. The problem is...
Can I just jump in very quickly? So the idea of a game is really important, and the rules of the game. So what's happened is that to the extent that we have lost the common understanding of our reality, then people start attacking the rules of the game. And that's, going back to my work on conflict, that's that you're only a few steps away from mass violence at that point, because as soon as you start to attack the rules of the game, you're starting to say that some people are not playing by rules anymore that we agree with, and they are essentially outside the moral ambit of our community. In other words, we don't think anything they think is legitimate anymore. Even their status as human beings is not legitimate anymore. And that's just a short step away from the kind of massive, inhumane violence, mass violence that we've seen, for instance, in the 20th century, where you have genocides, carpet bombing, grotesque acts of terrorism, etc. It's that move towards believing that other people are not playing by the rules of the game that is so dangerous.
So do you think then that we are not far away from that kind of a moment right now?
It's very interesting. I think that it's kind of up in the air. I said at the beginning, it's like all the pieces are unlocked and everything is in motion. And I think the pandemic has been a moment that has both accentuated these tendencies, but also reminded us in some ways of something that's very important and that we should remember with respect to a problem like climate change, that we are in a situation of shared fate on this planet. This is a very small place, and there are a lot of us here, and we've got to do things now pretty carefully, or we're all going to end up all of us in a very bad place. We can't. It's not the case that a few of us can go off and gate ourselves off and protect ourselves. I get asked quite frequently by people, so where can I go? Where can I go when climate change gets bad? Where can I go when things start to fall apart? And my answer is, well, nowhere, because it's going to affect us all. Climate change is affecting the entire atmospheric oceanic system of the planet. You can try to go to Tasmania or New Zealand or Iceland, but the energy imbalances and the extremes of climate are going to get you there just as much as anywhere else.
Well, Peter Thiel is going to New Zealand, definitely, and then his buddy Elon Musk wants to go to Mars.
Yes, well, very few of us are going to get to Mars. And, for the folks who want to fly to New Zealand when things start to fall apart, my first question is, well, are you going to take your pilot's family? Are you going to take your mechanic's family? Are you going to take an entire warehouse of all of the bits of technology, from the bearings in your jet engines to extra chips for your computers down there, so that you can sustain the complex system of services and technologies that you rely upon? And what happens, by the way, when some kind of new virus or antibiotic resistant bacteria infiltrate their way into New Zealand, which they will, and the medical system of the world has fallen apart, and you're there by yourself watching this come? I mean, you can try to shut yourself off from these changes, but all that's really going to happen for these extraordinarily wealthy folks with in their estates in New Zealand with their landing strips and stuff, is that they're just going to have an extra couple of decades to watch things fall apart around them. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't sound very appealing to me. So to get back to my point, we're in a situation of shared fate. And I think that the pandemic has helped remind many people around the world of this reality. So whether we're going to go to what I would call the Mad Max world, where everybody thinks but other folks aren't playing by the rules and we need to fight and we need to prepare to kill them, or whether we're going to go to a pathway where we see that we actually have to pull together to solve these problems together, I think that's very much up in the air. I think it's an open question at the moment.
Well, how do you feel from sort of, I don't want to call it criticism, but it's kind of like they're kind of stealing the light from this issue in a way by, take Elon Musk. He says that the biggest threat humanity has ever faced is artificial intelligence. And then you have Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, even Dr. Stephen Hawking said that the beginning of AI may be the end of humanity. Elon Musk even said that AI is more dangerous than nukes, which I totally disagree with him. And actually, when I go and do my keynotes, I often say that in my view, the most dangerous phenomenon on our planet is human stupidity. It's not artificial intelligence, because we're not anywhere close to artificial general intelligence, but yet human stupidity is prevalent all over the place. And and as you said in the beginning, the enemy is us, right? And that's also the point that I'm trying to get across when I go out and speak there. But yet people who are kind of getting disproportionate amount of mass media coverage, like Elon and others, are pushing the line that AI is the most dangerous thing on our planet.
Well, so that you raised a bunch of really interesting points. And by the way, to my previous list, I would need to add nuclear weapons and their possible use. That's an issue that I started working on when I was a graduate student at MIT. That was one of the principal reasons I went there. I was part of a group of researchers focusing on the US-Soviet arms race in those days in the 1980s. It's still an enormous challenge. I actually talk in the book about a woman back in the 1950s, Stephanie May, who mobilized mothers around the world to.
She's my next question, so keep that story, because I'm going to ask you, because it's the best story for hope. So keep it to the side.
Yeah, so we'll keep that. But the nuclear weapons issue figures quite prominently in the book. And I'd also agree that in some broader sense, and this is why I spend so much time inside people's minds and talking about psychology and social psychology, that it's a kind of human stupidity or hubris, lack of moral compass, incapacity to see the world as other people see it, that we need to address. And so in the book, that's why I spend a lot of time providing people with some basic tools so they can, for instance, understand other people's worldviews better. So artificial intelligence. When I was at MIT, I spent a fair amount of time working with artificial intelligence researchers in the 1980s. Now, of course, it was very different in those days. That was just the beginning of neural net research, thinking machines and the like. But I did get a pretty good understanding of the basic premises of artificial intelligence and potential applications, for instance, in natural language understanding, understanding everyday speech. And I've watched the evolution and the hype around artificial intelligence over the last few years with a bit of skepticism. It sounds like we probably share that skepticism. I think the most dangerous thing about AI is not super smart AI, it's stupid AI. It's artificial intelligence that is good enough to be put in charge of certain processes in our societies, but not good enough to not make really bad mistakes.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's interesting that people have backed off a little bit with autonomous vehicles. You know, everybody was super excited about autonomous vehicles, and
Elon was telling us we'd be driving them everywhere by 2020.
Right. Yeah, and then it turns out that it's actually fairly easy to spoof an autonomous vehicle system and its recognition of a stop sign by putting some kind of little distracting symbol on the stop sign, and then it no longer recognizes it. And then there's this broader issue of being able to get inside other people's heads as we're driving down the road. All the time, we're looking at other people, and because we have very advanced theories of mind, we are coming to very quick decisions about what they are doing in their driving behavior, or whether they're pedestrians on the side of the street about to cross in a crosswalk or something. And we do things like we look at the direction of their eyes, we look at the expression on their face. If we're talking about somebody that might be just about to step into a crosswalk, we look at whether they're having a conversation with somebody. We look at whether we think they're distracted or paying attention. And we do all that processing incredibly fast. It's something that we've learned to do ever since we were toddlers, basically, interpreting social arrangements and social behavior around us. And it requires a very sophisticated understanding of human intentionality and human agency. You can try to program that into an AI system using a series of decision rules, and you will get it right most of the time, maybe even 99.9% of the time. But that 0.01% of the time can kill people. And I think what we're going to find with a lot of these technologies is that is that human beings actually do this stuff better and will continue to do it better for a long period of time. So I don't see the Terminator future coming to pass. I see something more like, I think it would be a good example of stupid AI in pop culture. I was thinking of Colossus: The Forbin Project, which was a movie from the 1970s. It was sort of a precursor to the Terminator series. But even there, the computer is obviously incredibly smart, and sort of outstrips human intelligence. In this case, I think it's more likely that we will think that this particular set of procedures, AI procedures that we linked into our strategic nuclear weapons system, will keep us safer. But we haven't recognized that that there are consequences, glitches in it that make it actually stupid, and it mistakes the flock of geese for an incoming barrage of Russian missiles and unleashes everything in response before we can intervene. So that's stupid AI, and I find that actually very dangerous. I don't think that it's going to supersede human intelligence anytime soon, but we could end up relying on it too much that it causes us catastrophic problems.
Yeah, I agree with that. But so before I ask you about Stephanie's May story, let me just ask you one last thing here on this, because there's people like Steven Pinker who would tell us about the better angels of our nature. I've had here Ray Kurzweil, who was telling us that the singularity is near. I've had Peter Diamandis, who told us that, we are going to live, and we already live in a world of abundance. And not only that, but the future is better than we think.
Yes.
So you have these people who, I call, just like you, the techno-solutionists. And yet they are, again, taking a big chunk of the media coverage, and they're very capable of sending their message out there. People want to hear their message. People want to pay for their message. Then the doomsayers like you, or the skeptics and the sort of poor philosophers like me, they're not so popular. So How do you feel about that? What's the best attitude and behavior towards it, and how do we resolve that problem, or if it's a problem at all?
Well, maybe it's self-serving, but I would say it's one of the burdens that realists have to bear, right? So I'm not inclined, and this may, this is self-serving and maybe enormously unfair, but I'm not inclined simply to tell people stories they want to hear. Of course, people want to hear that the future is going to be good. Of course, people want to hear that there's this trajectory of increasing abundance, that we can use our minds to solve all the problems we have,
and we'll live to get forever on top of it.
Right, exactly. And as you know, I think it's in chapter 9 of the book, or chapter 8, I mention these folks, all of the ones you just talked about. Kurzweil, Pinker, Diamandis, all of them are all mentioned. And I refer to them as techno-optimists. And Pinker is a little bit distinct because for him, it's not just about improving technology and technological possibility in the future. It's about the capacity of human reason to expand its ambit, its scope, and how that over time it drives an expanding radius of empathy and what you might call more tolerant values within our societies, producing more peace, more cooperation. There's much, especially when it comes to Pinker, there's much I'm sympathetic with, and that I think we could have a very constructive conversation. But I think one of the mistakes that all of these folks make is they have a fairly selective interpretation of the past, where they identify a series of data points that suggest that things have improved a lot, and they have improved a lot. When you look at mortality, sickness around the world, when you look at general quality of life, we've seen extraordinary improvements in the spread of basic freedoms, although some of that's been ratcheted back over the last little while, last few years. But if you look back over the course of the last century, the quality of human life in general has improved enormously. But the mistake is to assume that it's to extrapolate those trends into the future and assume that the future is going to be simply a linear extrapolation or a more or less straight line extrapolation of the past. And instead, I think what we're looking at is the emergence of potential tipping points and massive negative nonlinearities in the system. And we can say that because we've seen these kinds of things happen in civilizations before, where people have said, oh, it's all good and we're all okay, and we just have to keep doing more of what we're doing, and we're on a great trajectory here. And then things go off a cliff. And the evidence is suggesting that there are cliffs coming. We don't know how close they are, but it could be coming soon, and they could be a disastrous consequence for us. So there's this tendency to look to the past and assume the past is going to be the
future is a better version of the past.
Right. The future is going to be basically a version of the past. And then the other part of it is that they frequently, they're quite selective in their use of data, and they highlight successes, and they aren't paying attention to sort of the structural inequalities in the global system and the enormous numbers of people who haven't actually seen a huge amount of improvement at all.
Or the cost to other species and the plant, the biosphere.
Right. And these external costs, which are building up kind of what I say beyond the horizon of our visibility. We dump a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We don't see the consequences for a long time. And that's allowed us to transfer wealth essentially from the future and from our natural environment into our present consumption. But those costs are now starting to impinge upon us in major ways. So, I look at Pinker's book, his latest one, Enlightenment Now. And I read very carefully his section on climate change. He takes climate change seriously. But for me, this is a litmus test, right? He takes climate change seriously. He recognizes the gravity of the problem. But he still thinks that ultimately we can solve this fairly easily if we just apply our brains to it. Well, we've been trying to apply our brains to it in some ways for almost 30 or 40 years now, and we aren't making any progress, virtually no progress when you look at carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere. So it suggests that maybe that kind of optimism about human reasoning and rationality is misplaced.
Yeah, and even the whole idea of what the Enlightenment was. I interviewed Ada Palmer, who is one of my favorite historians from the University of Chicago, and she was talking about how people have this kind of romantic view of the Enlightenment, but how most people don't know the fact that life expectancy dropped from 35 to 18 during the beginning and middle stages of the Enlightenment, and how there were many communities where men of fighting age were completely disappeared, were an extinct species simply because of the violence that was ever present in those societies. Especially at the heart of the Enlightenment, the Italian city-states and all the neighboring countries. Like, it was literally the Hobbesian state of war of one against all at all times, basically. And even when it's historically a peace period, there is still ever-present violence at so many levels, right?
Yes. Yes. And even during the Industrial Revolution, which laid the foundation for this explosion of wealth around the planet in the 20th century, but in the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, the Dickensian period in the 19th century, there was a sharp decline in the well-being of large numbers of people as they were moved into essentially these labor pools to power factories and the like. So there are huge costs. These transitions involve huge costs, and it's easy to be Pollyanna-ish about it, to sort of look at only the bright possibilities and the bright sides and select the data. And I think there's a lot of data selection going on with these folks.
Yeah, especially if you're on the beneficiary end of things, if you end up being on the upside rather than the downside. Unfortunately, Tad, time is really advancing, so I'm starting to get concerned here. We only have 20 minutes left. So let's quickly touch on the best story about hope that I've heard in a very long time, which is the story of Stephanie May. And then we can hopefully jump towards what we can do about all of this. So now we've laid the groundwork, and we spent most of the time laying the groundwork of how profound of a problem we're facing today. And we touched on many of its facets. Now let's talk about the most hopeful story I've ever heard. One I've never heard before I actually read your book, which is the story of Stephanie May.
Okay, so Stephanie May, it's very serendipitous. I stumbled upon this story. So I'll tell a story about the story, and then I'll tell the story itself. So the story about the story is that back when I started my university education here on Vancouver Island at the University of Victoria in 1976, I guess, 75, 76, long time ago. there was a Canadian scholar and international public official by the name of Bill Epstein at the University of Victoria. He was taking leave from the United Nations to write a book on nuclear proliferation. He was one of the world's leading authorities on the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. And he was also the most senior Canadian in the United Nations Secretariat. But he was visiting for a year to write his book, and we got to know each other. He became my mentor for a number of years. And somewhere around that time, it might have been a couple of years later, he said to me, it was the mothers that made all the difference. He said, it was mothers mobilizing around the world that stopped the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And
if you're unfamiliar with that history that you're about to share with us, that sounds like the most ridiculous statement.
Yes, it does. And actually, their mobilization around the world was the impetus for the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was the first major arms control agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union that put testing of nuclear weapons underground instead of testing in the atmosphere. So, I filed that in the way in the back of my mind and think about it. But 40 years later, when I'm working on this book, I realized I needed a story that would really capture this notion of hope that I was developing. And I remembered what Bill had told me. So I went to the web, as we do nowadays, and I entered a few search terms. And before long, I came up with a chapter in a book, and it had no name on it, but just said the title of the chapter was "My Mother Helped Save the World." And so I started investigating, and after a while, I discovered that the chapter was about this woman, Stephanie May, and I'll tell the story in a second. That the chapter had been written by Elizabeth May, who was the leader of the Green Party in Canada at the time, and somebody I happened to know. So I wrote to Elizabeth right away, and I said, "Gee, I'd like to know more about your mother and her work to stop the testing of nuclear weapons in the 1950s." And so Elizabeth said, "Well, I think my brother still has her memoirs at our old house in Cape Breton, because the May family had moved from the United States to Canada in the early 1970s. So I went out to Cape Breton a couple of months later, and I met Jeffrey May, and he brought over his mom's memoirs. It was a 400 pages typed manuscript, of which no other copy existed. And he said at the same time, "I think you'll be interested in these scrapbooks." So he tossed a couple of scrapbooks on the table. And the scrapbooks were full of Stephanie May's correspondence with some of the most remarkable people in the 1950s and 60s. Pure gold. I just couldn't believe it. I was absolutely stunned by this. So that became the material for telling the story about Stephanie May. And the story is basically this. Stephanie May was a housewife in Bridgeport, Connecticut in the 1950s. And she was reading the newspaper, and she learned that an enormous number of tests that the Soviet Union and the United States were conducting in the atmosphere of atomic bombs and then hydrogen bombs were basically shrouding the entire planet in radioactive material, which was bioaccumulating into ultimately fodder and the milk from cows that her children were drinking, and was substantially increasing the risk of leukemia for children around the world. And Stephanie just thought this was outrageous. So she started what she could do at a local level. She started a petition, and she phoned local clergymen and priests and others in her community and asked them to distribute her petition to their parishes. And working with another housewife over a period of time, she got a couple of thousand signatures on a petition, which was a lot in those days. This is hard. You actually had to
do the legwork, no email.
You had to do the legwork. It wasn't all web-based in those days. She was working with carbon copies and Gestetners and things like that. So to cut a long story short, within 2 or 3 years, she had connected with and mobilized mothers all over the United States. And I talk about by 1961, she went to England, where she met Bertrand Russell. She became very close friends with the philosopher Bertrand Russell. She went to England and was at the head of the Aldermaston March, which was a march from a nuclear research facility called Aldermaston to London. And then in front of 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square in London, she brought greetings from all the mothers in the United States who were working on this challenge of stopping testing. So I follow that story through the whole book. and the last, there are a number of episodes because it was hard for her. There were many times when she wanted to give up, when it seemed like it was impossible. But the final episode, she's engaged in a hunger strike outside the Soviet mission. And this is, I think, about 1961, late 61, if I recall. And the Soviets, there had been a moratorium agreed to testing between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets had just declared they were breaking the moratorium and they were going to explode the biggest bombs in history, a whole series of them. Yeah. So Stephanie said, this is crazy. This is not just about opposing the United States, it's about opposing the Soviet Union too. And her community of activists was not inclined to go as far as she was. And Stephanie said, well, I just have to do something. So she went on hunger strike outside the Soviet mission to the United Nations in New York. And she was just there by herself for days. And then all of a sudden the media started to pay attention. And she got national attention across all the major media in the last days of her hunger strike. And at that point, hunger strikes started all the way across the country, other mothers deciding that something had to be done. So I use Stephanie's story as a way of talking in a very personal way about this notion of hope, because her hope had those characteristics of honesty, astuteness, and it was psychologically powerful in just the way I try to articulate in the book. She's a living and breathing example of commanding hope. I think an example today of somebody who is exhibited the same kind of hope is Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish climate activist who is extraordinarily astute about how to operate strategically in her political and social environment. She's deeply honest about and realistic about the nature of the climate crisis and the science. And she has a very clear moral vision of where she wants to go, just the way Stephanie did. So that's the powerful hope component. That's the object of her hope is very clear in her mind. And I think these stories tell me that this is a capacity that we all have inside ourselves to make a difference. Stephanie didn't start out to change the world. She just started out to do something. And she ended up changing the world.
But in the end, she actually led to the treaty. Her actions led us to the treaty banning atmospheric nuclear weapons testing.
Right. So the interesting thing is there are a lot of different people involved. I mean, there were scientists and politicians and journalists, and there were all kinds of people who said, this is nuts. But what Stephanie did, and I do a systems analysis using some work of the famous systems theorist Donella Meadows, she actually, very deliberately, she wasn't a systems theorist, of course, but she knew what she was doing strategically. She created channels of communication between mothers who otherwise have been this kind of diffuse, amorphous group, disconnected group of people. She created a community identity of concerned mothers across the United States. And then she created a channel of communication between those mothers and very powerful politicians in Washington. And those politicians, she didn't let those politicians forget about the mothers. She just kept hammering away. And she was very good at making her point about the importance of the mothers and the children in sort of crystal clear aphoristic ways, like single sentences and single arguments that just, sometimes just left her opponents kind of speechless. They didn't know what to say because she was very smart and she knew how to operate within the system because she knew she had this kind of very astute understanding of how the other people she was working with saw the world, whether they were opponents or allies, and she could work strategically with those folks and around those folks as necessary. So that's she was kind of a prototype of what all of us can do today. I think of the kind of astute systems operator that you need today.
So Tat, we have about 10 minutes left. So we managed to sort of lay out the story of the honest situation or challenge that we find ourselves in. We've gone through the story of Stephanie May, which is one of the most hopeful story about how a simple housewife from Connecticut can start the butterfly effect, which leads to the treaty banning atmospheric nuclear weapons testing.
Which, by the way, goes back to the pendulum, right? Because these small things can make a very big difference, right?
Absolutely dead on. And so, yeah. But now I want to bring in another element, where the pendulum metaphor is probably imperfect. because I want to bring in the importance of a story. And you here in one place of your book, and you're quoting somebody else when you say, when we get our story wrong, we get our future wrong. So we have about 8 minutes, Dad. What is the story that you want to tell us about how we should go about solving these problems, and the story of the future that would kind of inspire us and give us hope to actually start taking those actions? What's that story?
Right. So that's a wonderful quotation from David Corton, who talks about the importance of stories. And this is something I begin the book with my daughter, Kate, finding an academic article, a scientific article on my wife Sarah's desk, and it's a grim scientific article. It basically talks about potential tipping points in the global ecosystems in the future if we continue to damage global ecosystems as we are right now, and it comes up with a specific prediction for when those nonlinearities might occur, when we might start to see the global collapse of ecosystems around 2045. And Kate is 4 and she can't read the article, and she asks her mother, "So what's this story about, Mommy? What's Sarah going to say?" Right? So she says, it's about how the world might change when you're a little bigger, darling. And goes back to her marking at the time, but Kate flips the article over and takes some of Mummy's colored pens and does a picture, which is reproduced in the book, of her own story of the future, which is a flower growing out of the landscape and a big happy face on the flower, and little Kate's a stick figure at the bottom waving at the viewer. So she's created her own story about the future. And so I come back to this issue of stories and how we organize our thinking and worlds around stories, and especially it's stories of what our own purpose in life is, how we respond to our desperate fear of mortality and death. I draw on the work of the anthropologist and social psychologist Ernest Becker, which has been elaborated by social psychologists in something called terror management theory. To create these hero stories, these sense of immortality projects. We're going to be good parents. We're going to write a book. We're going to have a wonderful podcast. We're going to be a good community member. We're going to help build our local faith community. All of these things give us a sense of endurance and possibility beyond our mortal existence, right? They are symbolic hero stories or immortality projects. So we need to create these possibilities so people can see themselves in the future in such a positive way. At the end of the book, I say, there's another episode with Kate where she's very scared because she thinks something bad's happening, and she turns to me with tears in her eyes, and she asks, "Will this story have a happy ending?" And it's funny, we never ask that as adults because we know that most stories don't have a happy ending, and in fact, there's no ending to most stories. The world just keeps unfolding. But this book is really my, in a sense, attempt to articulate a story for my children. I start at the beginning of the book by talking about how kids build their imaginary realities. And Ben and Kate, when they were playing together when they were young, used the phrase "how about" all the time. How about, we create this with Lego blocks? How about we imagine this world and then live in it for a while? And we forget to do those how abouts. And in some sense, this book, Commanding Hope, is my how about for the children. And I think they can have a life full of purpose and meaning in the future. This is going to be, to get directly to your question, this is going to be a period of time of enormous import for the human species. It really is all on the line this century. We're either going to grow up and learn to live as a mature species, a morally mature species, a not stupid species in this small ecosystem and flourish together along with nature, or we're going to probably wipe ourselves out. It won't happen in one big bang. It'll be a long, extended process of disintegration of social order and decline in well-being. But over the long run, that's a species dead end. It might take centuries, it might take millennia, but it's a species dead end. So everything's on the line, and this is a moment where everybody can play a role. It's an extraordinary, exciting time in the evolution of our species. And it's a time when we can start to articulate new possibilities for the future, moral possibilities about how we see each other, so that we don't end up fighting each other. So I don't know. And the other part of this thinking about stories is to recognize that we don't know the worlds around us, the systems around us well enough to know that good things are impossible. So if somebody had said, and to come to the Greta Thunberg example, if somebody had said in 2017 that a little girl, 14 or 15 years old, is going to sit on the steps of the Swedish Parliament building with a sign saying in Swedish, "School strike," and her little backpack beside her, and she was going to galvanize a global movement of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people to demand climate action, we would have said, oh, that's a ridiculous idea. It's never going to happen. And yet it was right there across the boundary of what complexity scientists call the adjacent possible. It was just invisible to us. And Greta Thunberg single-handedly pulled it into the present and made it possible, pulled it into reality. There are many, many other possibilities out there, positive possibilities, I'm sure. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean they aren't there. And that gives me an enormous sense of hope. You do the Stephanie May thing, you do the Greta Thunberg thing, you do what you can in your own lives, you think big and you use your imaginations. We don't know what the possibilities are here for positive change. We may be on the cusp. This is the core of my positive story. We may be on the cusp as a species of a transformative revolution in human perspectives and living on this planet. It has happened before in the past. The great German existential philosopher Karl Jaspers has spoke of the axial age between 600 BCE and 200 BCE, during which 5 human civilizations all shifted their cosmologies simultaneously. They weren't communicating much with each other, but that shift in cosmology laid the groundwork for modernity. We may be on the cusp of a second axial age in the 21st century. And because the moment that we face as a species is completely unprecedented. We've never been in a situation like this before. So it's quite conceivable that unprecedented positive changes are possible for us. That's the story I tell about to my children that they can be part of. It's scary, exciting, but it's also meaningful. And meaning is the most important thing of all if you're going to push through scary times.
Tad, for those of our viewers and listeners who may be interested in hearing more about your story and following you further along on your journey and perhaps even doing what we all hope they would do, which is to become active participant in that story, what's the best place for them to follow you and your work?
Well, they can go to my website, which is Homer-Dixon.com, without a hyphen, HOMERDIXON.com. They can go to the book website, Commanding Hope. There's a lot of stuff there, including direct links to some of these tools for modeling people's belief systems. One that I talk about in the book called Cognitive Affective Mapping. We have software that allows anybody to do that, basically to represent other people's points of view, their emotional responses to the world, to a problem like climate change or to Black Lives Matter or anything. You can use these maps for all kinds of useful purposes. But the other thing I think it might be worth keeping an eye on is this new institute that I've worked to found here on Vancouver Island. It's called the Cascade. And in some ways, Commanding Hope is a 100,000 word pitch for what we're trying to do in the Cascade Institute, which is identify these possibilities for producing really big changes with relatively small interventions. Again, going back to the pendulum, if you just start the pendulum in a slightly different way, it follows a very different pathway. And so the Cascade Institute is about finding what we call high leverage intervention points in people's belief systems, in our institutions, in our technologies that allow us to tip the world more quickly in a very positive direction. And there's lots of material there that anybody can read that can show them what some of these possibilities might look like and how we can implement some of them in our personal lives. So that's, in terms of the substance, I'd start with the Cascade Institute website. It's cascadeinstitute.org. And the Institute's only been around now for 10 months, but there will be a lot more there. And that's probably where we're going to be putting all of the stuff that's relevant to this more hopeful story.
And, I remember when I was playing with the pendulum itself, maybe I'm waving my own flag here, but my third attempt, I think, was pretty good and pretty impressive, relatively speaking. So I think hopefully what we could manage to do is kind of like, push it over 30, 40, 50, 60 years, which would give us more leeway,
Exactly.
more time to come up with better solution, better coordination, better story that would create that we-ness that you're talking about, or the Dalai Lama talks about oneness.
Yes.
And so that we can do what's required of us to do. But if we, just like I took that pendulum example for the rest of my life, now if people were to take a single lesson or the most important thing from our conversation with you today, what would you like that to be?
Well, we come back to the Stephanie May story and the Greta Thunberg story. I mean, in some ways, Greta Thunberg is an enormously unusual person for a whole bunch of reasons. But Stephanie May, by all intents and purposes, she was a regular, what we would have called in those days, a regular housewife. I mean, she showed the capacity of an individual, perhaps at the right time and place, but also an individual who's stubborn, smart, persistent, can produce extraordinary change. But you mentioned the issue of we-ness. One doesn't ultimately do it by oneself. One has to build communities and a sense of common identity around these projects. And so this starts, fundamentally with what one does in one's family and within this community, the conversations we have around the dinner table, how politically involved one is, and the kind of how much time one spends to actually learn about the issues so that one's smart about them. These things are all things that ultimately we can do as individuals. The changes will happen. If positive changes will happen, they will happen because of the aggregate effect of the actions of enormous numbers of individuals. If we don't act, if we don't have hope necessary to mobilize ourselves as individuals to act as individuals, then the worst outcomes will come to pass. So in some sense, it all starts ultimately in our own hearts and in our own emotions. And it's a necessary condition, I would say, is this kind of hope. It's not sufficient, because then you actually have to do something. But it starts with believing that we can do something and we can make a difference when we work together with each other.
Well, you know what? That kind of brings me to, and you talk about the book, the Tolkien distinction between two types of hopes, Andir and Estel. So can you perhaps send us away? Because I think this goes to the heart of what you're talking here, if I get this right.
Yes. So Tolkien, very interesting. I have a section in the book where I talk about the Lord of the Rings, and because I was reading it to Ben, and I realized about halfway through the first book that one reason this is such a riveting story for so many people is it's really a reflection. It's a meditation. Tolkien was meditating on what we should do when a situation looks completely hopeless, because it looked hopeless for the Fellowship of the Ring, and yet it wasn't. And in many respects, what Tolkien is articulating in the book is very similar to what I call commanding hope. The Fellowship was realistic, astute, and they had a powerful notion of the possibility of the future. So again, it's the same kind of hope. But Tolkien was a brilliant man, and as clear and deeply grounded in philosophy and human psychology. And it turns out that he reflected on the topic of hope. The concept of hope is mentioned about 300 times in The Lord of the Rings over the 3 volumes, but it isn't unpacked in detail. But in papers that were published posthumously by his son, there is an exchange, a fictional exchange that Tolkien wrote between an elf king or elf prince, I think, and an old woman about the nature of hope. And they introduce in this conversation the difference between two kinds of hope, Amdir and Estel. And now these are concepts of hope that are fictional within Tolkien's cosmology, within his Lord of the Rings cosmology, Middle Earth cosmology. But still, he's clearly homing in on his own philosophy of hope. And Amdir is a kind of hope very similar to what I would call commanding hope. It's grounded in the best knowledge we have of the world. It requires that you have some sense that good things are possible. The possibility may be very small, but they're still possible. We can have hope with very small possibilities, but those possibilities, he would argue, with this notion of Amdir, have to be grounded in real empirical facts and understanding of the world. But then he had this other notion of hope called ethical, which is a hope that is more objectless. It's more an attitude towards the future. It's the sense of that even if we can't see any clear positive possibility in the future that would ground Amdir, an Amdir kind of hope, we can still have this sense that there are things we don't know that mean that things could turn out well for us. And for me, what I think Tolkien is saying is that, just as I was saying before, our systems around us and our worlds are so complex that we actually will never know enough to be sure that there's no grounds for hope.
We cannot know enough to be pessimists, basically.
We cannot know enough to be pessimistic. And how does Gandalf put it at one point? He says, this is a remarkable statement. I must have reread this 1,000 times. He said, despair is only for those who know the future without any doubt. We do not.
Yeah.
And that, for me, is the uncertainty itself. Most people find uncertainty very scary. But for me, the uncertainty about the future is an enormous source of possibility. It's emancipatory. It means we can use our imaginations to explore alternatives all the time.
Despair is only for those who know the future for sure, and we do not. Now,
we do not.
I love that. Thomas Homer-Dixon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. This has been fun.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.